We have a question about soundtracks. Can we talk about soundtracks a little bit?
Hmm.
What is your process? Is the studio typically in control? Does the studio pay for the remix, et cetera, et cetera? Do they do the actual releasing, or is the soundtrack completely under your purview? I can speak to the business aspect of this a little bit.
Yeah.
Since I work for Warner Brothers and we put out TV and film soundtracks on our own in-house Water Tower Records label. So that is kind of the default when we're going to put out a soundtrack from the studio perspective. But as to the other questions, your process as the composer, who gets control about the remix, who pays for the remix, that kind of thing, that I will let you speak to.
Yeah, that's kind of different for every studio. Normally, I will try to be in control because I want to. Some composers don't want to. They're just handing it off and they're like, have the music editor make some edits and do whatever you want. I like to have the editing control over the thing. So I try to put that sneakily somewhere into my contracts that I get the first right to produce a soundtrack album. And only if I refuse to do it can they bring in another person and have them do it. Not every studio is going to play ball. So not every studio is going to let me have that clause, but most of them do, or most of them just don't check it and they just gloss over it. And then later on, I'm like, all right, I'm going to be making the soundtrack album then, as it is in my contract.
This is a good time to say my plug about reading your contract. You would
Yeah.
be shocked how many composers don't know what's in their contract. And I encourage everybody to take the onus upon yourself and read it. And if you don't know what it means, find somebody to ask.
Mhm.
But know what's in there and know what you want to put in there, and really,
Yeah.
take control as much as you can. And like Anne is saying, she wants the soundtrack control. She puts it in there. Most of the time, nobody notices. So you can advocate for yourself in that way. It's really shocking actually how few people are paying attention, and how much of the time you're not even going to get any pushback. So it's worth trying. The worst that happens is they redline it. Oh well,
Yeah. And they will send it back to you and go, nope. And then I'll go, well, can we find a middle ground?
And no never killed anybody. Don't be afraid of the no.
Exactly. Yeah, this is kind of the thing where there will be a clause in your contract about soundtrack. And if there isn't, put one in there that is in your favor. I mean, I have a label that frequently works with me, Movie Score Media. So whenever the studio doesn't have a label that they want me to use, then I just get to choose my label. I also put that into my contract that if the studio doesn't bring me a label, I can choose the label, but they have the first right to pick. So I remember for Enchanted Sisters, for example, they gave to BMG. So that was it for me. I could not choose my label. Or on Fearless, for example, they chose Jay-Z's sublabel. What was it called? Equity. So again, they had a contract with them. I had no power over that. But I still had the clause in my contract that I get to produce the score album. So I was still in charge of making the edits. They, of course, have to approve them. So if they disagree with something, or they want a different track order for better playback, or they want a different edit, sometimes they do. Sometimes they want to do a mastering pass. I'm not usually in charge of that. The label usually does that. So, there are things that aren't in my control ever, but usually it's a collaboration. That's not always the case. Sometimes the composer is completely bypassed and someone else is making the edits and they just completely rework the album, and the composer hears it and goes, yeah, that was not my creative intention, but cool. Because you don't have the publishing rights to anything, of course. So at the end of the day, they can block anything you're doing by just saying, no, we're not publishing that. So you kind of have to make it a collaboration. But I always make sure they know I want to be creatively involved. It's kind of my vision, and they get to veto it if they want to, but I would like a first pass on what goes out there. And usually they don't fight me on it because it's actually a lot of work to do a remix. Sometimes they pay for the remix, sometimes I do. Sometimes there is no remix. If I'm happy with the score mix as it is, we're just not remixing it. The label's just going to do a mastering pass. But making the score edits is actually a lot of work. So they're usually kind of happy if they don't have to take care of that. And yeah, then I will just send them a proposal with all the metadata and everything, who owns what of which track, who's the performer, and all the data they need for registration. And then yeah, they will do their mastering pass, or they will send me notes back like, oh hey, we don't like the flow of this track, or hey, we don't like this track order, can we change it to this maybe, or hey, we disagree with this track title because it's a spoiler, can we name it something else, just random things that I don't think about. And then I'll make those changes, and then we have our soundtrack album. The label usually takes care of the cover art. I don't do that. And yeah, I usually just give some PR stuff to them, photos or footage from the sessions, or some quotes that they can use for marketing. But then that's usually out of my hands. I don't really have much to do with that once the album is with them and they're just releasing it.
That's so smart to give them more materials to promote. I think, with so much content on the market now with all the streamers, it's the trick is to stick out, right? And the more you can do to help your material stick out, the better. So that's really good.
Something common they also do is pre-release exclusive tracks. You can see it right now with the new Justice League soundtrack. They're pre-releasing tracks from the soundtrack album, or they've done this with Wonder Woman 1984, that they've pre-released some of the music, not the whole album, but just like the title track or something. So this is done. Sometimes the songs get pre-released or something. But this is kind of on the label. Like, I don't have the power to do that. I don't own anything. So I own the writer's share, but nothing of the publishing. So I don't have the authority to do any of this. This is kind of between the studio and the label. They need to give each other the rights to do this, and then they can do their PR thing.
Yeah, as far as, there was a follow-up question in the chat as to whether you put a clause in your contract reserving the right to release a soundtrack, and that's usually the right of first refusal to release is with the studio. But as much as you can advocate for creative control, even though you're not going to necessarily have the right to release in your purview.
Yeah, on studio productions, even small size studios like indie studios, they will not allow you to put that in. Like, you can't just release it. I've had like 1 or 2 projects that were really small and they really paid like shit, and I actually kept some of my publishing as well, where I just put in the clause, that I have also the right to release the soundtrack. And they didn't block it because they were underpaying me so much that they were like, whatever she wants is fine. But that really only works on, ultra low budget indie productions, where you can just be like, hey, you want me? Well, I want this. So
Yep, it can be a bargaining chip too. That's a good point. Especially on projects where you're not getting paid what you should. Exactly. You can at least say, well, let me put out my soundtrack and try and get some PR for the score.
Exactly.